Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Philosophy of Cognitive Science with me, Dr. Josh Redstone. And today's lecture is the final lecture of the semester. So congratulations, everybody. We've just about made it to the end. All right. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, as I mentioned last time on my very brief lecture on enactivism and the strong sensory motor theory, I thought it would be really great to talk a little bit about consciousness because Clark does devote an entire appendix to questions that surround consciousness and subjective experience, and in particular what David Chalmers calls the easy problems and the hard problem. And then at the very end, Clark kind of introduces what he calls the meta-hard problem of consciousness. So I thought I would talk today briefly, once again, about the easy problems, the hard problem, and the meta-hard problem. So we'll end up talking a little bit about what Clark means by this meta-hard problem. What exactly is this problem? Many people who are or who have some familiarity with the kinds of stuff we've talked about in this class will have heard of the easy problem and the hard problem. Or really there are easy problems and one hard problem according to Chalmers. But I doubt that many of you are very familiar with this meta-hard problem, as Clark calls it. So that's where we're going to end up. But first we'll talk a little bit about what we mean by consciousness. You know, what are we talking about when we're talking about consciousness as philosophers and cognitive scientists. Earlier this year, I had the privilege of teaching my first philosophy of mind class. That was from January to through the end of April of 2020 at Carleton University. And it was great fun, mostly because we did it as a consciousness studies class. So that was really fantastic. And consciousness is one of those areas that I've always been interested in, but which it can be a little difficult to approach. In fact, I made a comment like this once to Professor Andrew Brooke at Carleton University when I was speaking with him back in my grad student days. I said, I'd sure love to study consciousness, but I just don't know where to begin. And he kind of chuckled at me as if to say, yeah, welcome to the club. Of course, Dr. Brooke is well known in philosophical circles for his studies into consciousness. Andrew Brooke, I should mention, is also the not just a premier scholar on consciousness, among other things like Kant, but also the founder of the Cognitive Science program at Carleton University, founder of the Institute of Cognitive Science, where I received my PhD. And it is probably one of the only fully integrated cognitive science departments in the world. It's certainly the only fully integrated one that I'm aware of in Canada. So it was a very cool place to get to study, and I got to study a little bit of consciousness stuff while I was doing my PhD. But since that wasn't where my area of focus was for my thesis, I kind of had to wait until I taught this class to really sink my teeth into it. And the reason I'm telling you all of this is because as many different sources and ideas and stuff we were able to look at that in that class, my students and I, we still barely scratched the surface. And much of what Clark talks about in this appendix, appendix number 2, also barely scratches the surface. And even though I did talk about some similar things that Clark talks about in this appendix, such as the hard problems and the easy problems and so on, I also talked about many different things because I used a different source for my consciousness studies class. So all of this is to say that there is a lot of material out there. I will not be able to cover everything in this brief lecture. In fact, As you've probably guessed, I am only covering selective bits from this appendix, and for the rest of it, I'm going to be riffing. I'm going to be mentioning interesting things from the course that I taught on consciousness in the winter semester of 2020. And yeah, that's what we'll do. So this is kind of like last time with the inactivism lecture. This lecture is meant to kind of allow you to dip your toes in the pool of consciousness studies, if you like. So we're not going to be exhaustive, but we're going to go over some important things, just enough of the important themes and ideas to get us to be able to think about what Clark is calling the meta-hard problem of consciousness. So, with all of that said, let's dive in and talk a little bit about what consciousness is and how philosophers and cognitive scientists typically approach consciousness as a topic of study. All right, let's get started. Well, as David Chalmers sings in his song, The Zombie Blues, what consciousness is, I ain't got a clue. Actually, there are a few different answers we could give to this question. One very obvious one is that we're conscious when we're awake and aware, right? Typically, we talk about consciousness in the sense that we're aware of things, right? Just compare when you're awake, perhaps, when you're sitting down to watch this lecture at your computer or television or smartphone. Compare that to when you're asleep, of course. When you're asleep, you're not conscious. Nothing happens. I mean, things happen in the body and in the world, but you're not aware of them typically, unless something very loud or surprising happens. Your alarm clock goes off, for example. So that's one way we can think of being conscious, is just being aware or awake, as opposed to being asleep. But of course, things quickly get muddy. Even if we take this simple being awake and aware versus being asleep and unaware kind of approach to consciousness. For example, when we are awake, there are certainly degrees of consciousness that we could talk about, degrees of awareness, if you like. Just compare, for example, the difference in your conscious experience if you're doing one of these two things, right? Let's say you've sat down to do some kind of mindfulness exercise, right? So here you're going to be doing things like focusing on your breathing, focusing on the environment, maybe sounds or smells that you hear. You're certainly going to focus on other things that your body's doing too, like maybe where your limbs are and how they feel. And you might passively let thoughts enter and exit your mind in a kind of nice, relaxing, meditative way, right? If you're doing something like this, you're very, very aware, likely. Likewise, if you're a skilled meditator, right? If you're doing, if you're a regular practitioner of meditation, or you like to do mindfulness exercises, you probably have a pretty good idea of what it means to be aware, right? Compare that to your everyday life when you're just going about your business. You're not as aware of as many things, probably, compared to when you're doing your mindfulness exercise. Compare this as well. Compare this to, say, if you're driving on a long drive, and you're kind of on automatic pilot, right? You're not unconscious, but you're kind of not paying that much attention to perhaps driving, because you drive this route all of the time. So your mind is elsewhere, and all of a sudden you're at home, and it seems like your long drive has gone by in a snap. So in this case, you're kind of less aware of the environment. You're kind of on automatic pilot. Indeed, this is handled by a lot of perceptual and cognitive processes that have become automatized, Perhaps you've been driving a car for a really long time, and you've been taking this way home for a really long time. So your brain can kind of go on automatic pilot, and you can think of something else, like what you're going to make for dinner that night. So you're less aware of your immediate surroundings, at least in that example. And things can get even more complicated when we think about sleep or dreams or altered states of consciousness, right? When you're in non-REM sleep, you are arguably quite unconscious. But if you're dreaming, are you conscious then? You're asleep. You're not engaging with the world, yet you seem to be having some kind of experience, albeit an experience that's generated completely offline by your brain. And compare, I don't know, having a regular dream to having, something like a lucid dream, where you know that you are in fact dreaming at that time. That is certainly more conscious, it seems to me, than a regular dream. Yet both of these happen when we are asleep and unconscious, right? So things can get pretty muddy here. To say nothing of altered states of consciousness, Perhaps you've ingested some kind of Perhaps you've ingested some kind of hallucinogenic substance which does not make you unconscious, but which changes your conscious experience. How do we make sense of this? Are you more conscious or less conscious, or is your conscious experience just different than it is typically speaking? So you can see this can get very, very complicated very quickly talking about consciousness, right? But one thing we can say with, I think, a reasonable degree of certainty is we're conscious when we're awake and aware. So awareness has to be part of consciousness. And indeed, when we're conscious of something, we're often, we can say that our conscious experience is about something. You are conscious of this or that. You might be conscious of something going on in the visual scene, of thoughts you're having, of experiences that are having, but your conscious experiences are intentional, right? They have content. They are always about something, right? But there's a particular aspect of consciousness that philosophers are really interested in, and that is subjective experience, or the subjective aspect of consciousness. Subjectivity, or what we might call subjective phenomenal experience. So that is what I would like to talk about next. So probably the most important, or at least the most interesting understanding of consciousness when it comes to philosophy and cognitive science and all of that is this. A conscious state is a state where there is something that it is like to be in that state. So consciousness is all about this subjective, phenomenal character of experience. At least that's the aspect of consciousness that interests me and lots of other philosophers and cognitive scientists as well. And this is why consciousness has been a little bit difficult to approach. The really interesting thing about consciousness that we want to understand is how this subjective experience comes about. But of course, it's a subjective experience, and science studies objective things. So we've had a heck of a time trying to apply our objective tools to understand the subjective elements of our conscious experience. Things like qualia, like I mentioned last time in the enactivism lecture. So consciousness for our purposes is, or rather I should say consciousness, conscious states and all of that, these are states where there is something that it is like to be in that state. There is something that it is like to sit here and talk to you. There's something that it is like to taste this cup of tea that I made earlier. There's something that it is like to enjoy a fine meal. There's something that it's like to be stuck out in the cold, right? There's this sort of what it's likeness to our conscious experiences. But having said that, what is it? Well, we don't know. Perhaps a better question to ask is, how does this come about? How does conscious experience happen? We don't know. Philosophers still disagree about a lot of this. Of course, most people think that consciousness is contingent upon the brain, right? But that's not what we always thought. Think here of somebody like Rene Descartes, right? Who was a substance dualist. He believed that there existed two different substances. We have our res extensa, extended substance. This is stuff that's made of matter, takes up space, so on and so forth. And then we also have res cogitans, or thinking substance, the mind, or really the soul, is how Descartes understood it. And it's not physical, it's not extended, it's immaterial, not made of matter. And somehow these substances, Descartes thought, must interact. So we have a material body, we have an immaterial mind or soul, which controls the body via the pineal gland, as he thought. It turns out this is not, in fact, what happens. This is not what your pineal gland is for. But, Descartes was working a few hundred years ago, so we won't begrudge him this. So, substance dualists like Descartes would say that mind and matter are different substances, and we're not going to be able to study consciousness because consciousness is a product of this mind substance, and it's immaterial. We can't study it with science, so if you're a dualist, if you're a substance dualist, okay, that might sound like a satisfying answer, but scientifically it's not a very satisfying explanation of consciousness. Although it does mesh nicely with, for example, many religious teachings around the world, it doesn't give us what we really want in this class, which is a philosophically rigorous, empirically supported explanation of how conscious experience comes about. In any case, that is what substance dualists would say about consciousness. But there's another type of dualist out there. Not too many philosophers these days are this kind of dualist, but certainly more are this kind of dualist than they are substance dualist. The kind of dualists I'm talking about are property dualists. They would say that consciousness, like the substance dualists, consciousness doesn't arise out of just the matter, the meat machine of the brain, but perhaps that consciousness arises out of informational properties, for example. And I think we can describe David Chalmers as falling into this camp. There are brains, and brains have physical properties, but brains also have informational properties, and perhaps it's these informational properties that allow consciousness to come about. So that's another possibility. Physicalists, of course, most philosophers of mind and cognitive scientists nowadays are physicalists, including myself. So a physicalist, as opposed to a substance dualist, is a type of substance monist. That means that they believe only one kind of substance exists. Physical substance, as the name suggests. And physical substance here includes matter and energy. Matter and energy are, of course, interchangeable if you remember studying your Albert Einstein, right? So physicalists would say that consciousness just arises out of physical processes in the brain, and we don't understand how that works just yet, but we will understand how it works one day if we continue to study the brain. One thing, of course, that physicalists are really keen on discovering is something called the neural correlates of consciousness. What is going on in the brain when we're conscious versus when we're unconscious? How are conscious states, if physicalism is true, realized by our meat machine in our heads, right? So that's physicalism. And there are other views as well on consciousness, like panpsychism. Panpsychism, I admit, is a weird one. But to try and understand panpsychism, you might recall something like idealism. The old philosophical view of idealism where unlike the substance dualists who said there's matter and there's mind, idealists would say, well, there's only mind. This is all mind. There's no external world. It's all mind. Whose mind? It could be the mind of God, that creates and sustains all of existence. Or maybe it's some kind of simulation, like the Matrix or something, right? But it's all mind, right? So panpsychists would say that either there is only mind, or that all matter also has some kind of mental properties. So I have this really exquisite, complicated brain, just like you do, so we have, pretty highly developed consciousness. My pupper here has a slightly less sophisticated mammalian brain. Perhaps she is conscious. I think you're conscious. But her conscious experience isn't the same as my conscious experience. It certainly isn't as rich. She doesn't like to think about philosophy very much. No, only food. You like to think about food, right? Yeah. But of course, a panpsychist would also say that inanimate objects have some level of consciousness as well. Rocks, trees, this lamp perhaps, right? All matter has some kind of mental properties, and perhaps when they're organized in the right way, we get, human level consciousness or dog level consciousness. But otherwise, it's not very conscious. Like a rock is much less conscious than a human on panpsychism. I personally think there is not anything it is like to be a rock. But I do think there's something that it's like to be a pupper. Yes. And of course, there are also the Epi Phenomenalists. Epi Phenomenalists, like Jaegwon Kim, for example, will say that conscious experiences are kind of like an illusion, in the sense that, okay, I'm having this experience, but I'm having this sense that I'm controlling what I'm doing and where I'm looking and whatever. But really, consciousness is an epiphenomenon. So it doesn't play any causal role in our mental life. The sense that we have this, a sense of choice, a sense of agency, and so on, this is all an illusion. So very interesting stuff there. But we're not going to talk too much about panpsychism or epiphenomenalism or dualism. We're going to move on, in fact. We're going to talk more about this, what it's likeness of consciousness. And we're going to try and distinguish between this understanding of consciousness and a couple of other ones before we get to the hard problem, the easy problems, and the meta-hard problem. So let's do that now. So for our purposes, consciousness is, subjective experience, right? Conscious experience is subjective experience. Conscious states are those states where there is something that it is like to be in that state. So it has this what it's likeness, or this phenomenal character. Phenomena in the philosophical sense are things as they appear, right? Think back to Kant, if you want to really grasp this kind of way we talk about phenomenality in consciousness studies, if you like. And sometimes we talk about this in terms of qualia, right? I mentioned qualia last time in the inactivism lecture. Qualia, or singular quale, are those phenomenal characteristics, right? Like the redness of a rose, the taste of my tea, which has a little milk and a little honey for sweetness. It's pretty good. But of course, some theorists, break things down a little differently. Like Ned Block, for example. Ned Block actually distinguishes between phenomenal consciousness and something called access consciousness. So this is actually going to be helpful for us to make this distinction. So let's briefly do it now. Access consciousness, what is access consciousness? Well, we have access consciousness of something when it is available for use in reasoning and planning and so on and so forth. We'll get to an example in a moment, but compare that with phenomenal consciousness. Phenomenal consciousness is, where there's something that it's like to be in that particular state. And this is where the real mystery seems to lie for a lot of thinkers. Access consciousness seems much easier to explain, right? So you can appreciate the difference between these two by thinking back to the example of the dual visual stream hypothesis, Ungerleider and Mishkin and Milner and Goodale's research, how we have these two visual streams that leave the visual areas of the occipital cortex and actually play different roles in our mental lives and in our problem-solving strategies, right? So we have one stream, we'll call it the what pathway, which is like a conscious stream. It allows us to identify objects, like lamp, mug, guitar. Over here there's a computer. So I'm using my what pathway for that, right? And it's conscious. It allows me to identify, visually report, and most importantly to see and have these visual experiences. But there's also another stream, right? And this we could call the where pathway. And the where pathway is unconscious. And it's employed when we do things like reach out for mugs of tea, or when we open doors, for example, right? And it's unconscious. So we use that for reaching, grasping, pointing, gesturing, and so forth. So we could think of the where pathway as something that handles something that's very access conscious-y, right? Whereas the what pathway is a little bit different. I think the what pathway certainly has a little bit of access consciousness going on there that it supports, but also certainly it supports phenomenal consciousness. And I did link you in a previous lecture to a short video featuring V.S. Ramachandran, who talked about the zombies in our heads, the ventral and dorsal streams and the role they play in regular, typical visual perception. And he talks a little bit about blind sight as well. I will link that again for you to take a look. But this is just, for me anyway, a nice way to appreciate the difference between access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness. There's nothing that it's like to have access consciousness. You just have whatever the contents of your access consciousness are, you can employ them in reasoning, planning, verbal report, and so on. Phenomenal consciousness is what has this what it's likeness aspect to it. It has a qualia, phenomenal character, however you want to call it. It's where the real subjectivity lies. So now we come to David Chalmers' distinction between the easy problems and the hard problem. What are the easy problems? Well, the easy problems are the problems that we can tackle using the tools we have as cognitive scientists. Now, a lot of the time, this has to do with access consciousness kind of stuff. When it doesn't, when we're more interested in, well, actually, no, we can talk about the neural correlates of access consciousness too, but when we talk about the neural correlates of phenomenal consciousness, what is going on in the brain when we have a conscious experience versus when we're unconscious, we're tackling the easy problems, right? These are objective problems, about the brain or about mind-body world couplings. Here we're talking about looking into things like working memory or, there's any number of examples that we could draw from contemporary cognitive science, and perhaps more so from branches of cognitive science like cognitive neuroscience or cognitive psychology. These are the easy problems because we can tackle them objectively, right? We can use our objective scientific tools to answer questions about, the neural correlates of consciousness, whatever, right? These are easy, but the hard problem is hard, according to Chalmers, because the hard problem is all about the task of explaining subjective experience, right? Another way you could put this is kind of by like reimagining the mind-body problem that substance dualists had to tackle all of those years ago, right? How does the non-material mind interact with the material body? It's not exactly the same problem, but it's very simple, very similar. The hard problem is basically explaining how subjective experience arises out of the brain, this meat machine, right? And not only that, but why does conscious experience have the particular character that it does? Why does redness seem red? Why do delicious foods smell good? You know, we can talk about red is red because it's a certain wavelength of light and it affects the rods and cones in the retina a certain way. And it causes different firing patterns in the occipital cortex. We can explain all that. Those are easy problems, comparatively. But why is red red and not some other color, right? Why do we have an experience of red in the first place? These are more hard problems, right? So that's the difference. And you can think about this, you can think about where you sit in this debate by, you know, doing some thought experiments, right? One of my favorite thought experiments when it comes to addressing the hard problem is the thought experiment that Chalmers uses, which features philosophical zombies. Philosophical zombies are really interesting. Can you conceive, you know, sit there and actually do this thought experiment? Can you conceive of a creature that is molecularly identical to you? You know, an atom for atom copy of you, okay? Now, once you've imagined this creature, ask yourself, does it have conscious experience? If you think that it's conceivable that there could be an atom by atom copy of you that has no phenomenal conscious experience, there's nothing that it's like to be this creature, you've imagined a philosophical zombie. All is dark inside for the philosophical zombie, to quote Chalmers. So, that's a philosophical zombie. If you can imagine this, if you think that this is conceivable, perhaps you think that we can't tackle the hard problem just by looking at what's going on in the brain. There's some other mysterious extra. Could be informational properties, could be a soul, right? But if there could be a physically identical entity to you without conscious experience, that would seem to suggest that we need some kind of extra, right? And this is what thinkers like John Searle and David Chalmers, this is what they're arguing for, right? Or, alternatively, you might think to yourself, well, if this was a molecule for molecule copy of me, surely it would be conscious. It would have the exact same brain working in the exact same way. Of course it would have conscious experience. If that's how your intuitions are pumping, then you're probably a physicalist. You would say your molecular doppelganger wouldn't be a zombie at all. It would be just another conscious entity, right? So, you know, in thinking about how you approach the hard problem or about where you sit when it comes to those different approaches to consciousness, you know, dualism, physicalism, those things, your intuitions when you go through this thought experiment will help you decide where you sit here. Whether you think the hard problem is really a hard problem or whether it's not really a hard problem and we will solve it. We just need to, I don't know, do more neuroscience, for example, and more philosophy and psychology and whatnot. So yeah, if you think that zombies are not conceivable, you probably think there is no hard problem. You're probably a physicalist. If you do think that zombies are conceivable, you might not be a physicalist. You might be a dualist of some kind, or perhaps a panpsychist. You also probably think that the hard problem is going to be pretty hard. because there's something mysteriously subjective about consciousness that we can't really tackle with our objective scientific tools that we use to tackle the easy problems. Now, of course, I'm barely scratching the surface here. I mean, there are lots of different theories of consciousness and lots of different thought experiments as well. Earlier, I talked about broad philosophical frameworks for approaching consciousness studies, like physicalism, dualism, and these are very much metaphysical theories, right? They don't just have implications about the mind; they have implications in all kinds of areas when it comes to the study of reality. So, dualism, physicalism, panpsychism, that's all metaphysics, right? But there are particular theories of consciousness and lots of other thought experiments that you can do. You know, there's thought experiments like, not just like the one we've just done with zombies, but there are, well, for example, there's Dennett's reply to David Chalmers, where he imagines a very complicated, self-reflecting zombie, which would be conscious in a similar way to us. He calls this a Zimbo instead of a zombie. Mary the Colorblind Scientist, another really interesting thought experiment meant to be an argument against physicalism. Of course, Frank Jackson, who initially offered this argument, has now changed his mind. He's more of a physicalist nowadays than he was before. But nonetheless, it's a fun thought experiment, and if you want to know about it, let me know. I will tell you all about it. Many theories of consciousness, too, some of which are talked about in the appendix from Mindware on consciousness, and some of which I talked about in my consciousness studies class that I mentioned earlier. You know, we have higher order perception and higher order thought theories of consciousness, which this is one of the things that Rosenthal is known for. Here, perceptions, thoughts, and whatnot are conscious if we have thoughts about them, you know, higher order thoughts. So if I have a thought about a thought, that is what makes my thoughts conscious, right? There's global workspace theory from Bernard Bars. This is a big one. On global workspace theory, we kind of have, if you want to imagine a stage, all kinds of things are going on in this stage. There's light and sound people, curtain people. These are all like your parts of your brain, your memory, your attention, and whatnot. And you have this spotlight of attention that shines on the stage, and if you like, whatever's in that spotlight is what is conscious. Some people have problems with this. Dan Dennett, for example, thinks it's a little too Cartesian theater-y. Again, I'm not going to go into detail on what that is, but if you're curious, let me know. And of course, Dennett's own theory of consciousness is the theory of multiple drafts, where we have different processes going on in the brain in concert, so that our conscious experience is kind of like a draft of the world that's always being updated and revised, right? We have other ones like theories that focus a lot on these thalamocortical loops and certain patterns of activity and frequencies of oscillation. Francis Crick is known for this. And then we have kind of like Mysterian arguments for consciousness, like Roger Penrose, for example, who is actually a physicist, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, but who argues that consciousness is not really computational. So there must be something extra. It's not just your brain doing this. There must be something else going on. So lots of different theories of consciousness that we just do not have time to talk about. Indeed, we could spend a whole course talking about this. And I've spent several. I've taken classes on consciousness, and I've taught a class on consciousness. And I still feel like I've barely scratched the surface. But if you want to learn more about consciousness, and you want to go beyond just the appendix in Mindware by Andy Clark, I recommend you check out Susan Blackmore's book, Consciousness: An Introduction. Really accessible, really fun to read, And the second edition, I believe it was the second edition that I used to teach my consciousness class, covers a lot of really cool stuff. Not just philosophical stuff like metaphysics and different theories of mind, but also altered states, dreams, paranormal experiences, a lot of really cool stuff that I think other thinkers are kind of leery about talking about. So do check that out. Also check out the Cambridge Handbook on Consciousness. I actually ordered a copy myself. Hi! I actually ordered a copy of this book myself, but unfortunately it has not gotten here yet. But I am looking forward to receiving it. And of course, check out the further reading section in Appendix II, because there's lots of other good materials there. And as always, just ask me if you're looking for some direction on how to find materials on consciousness. Hi. Oh. Well, this has been kind of a long roundabout way of working towards introducing this meta-hard problem, right? We've seen so far that the easy problems are the problems that, according to David Chalmers, we can tackle with our objective scientific tools. Questions about the brain's role in certain things, or questions about certain pathways in the brain, or certain cognitive faculties, and so on and so forth. Things like, how does aging affect memory? How does manipulating working memory affect conscious experience? Looking into things like change blindness and inattentional blindness. All kinds of neuroscience falls on that easy problem divide. We've also seen that Chalmers has identified the hard problem. The task of tackling this mystery of subjective consciousness, which he sees as a fundamentally different kind of enterprise that will require, he thinks a recognition of perhaps new laws of the universe, laws of thought perhaps, that capture how subjective conscious experience comes to be. Now, the meta-hard problem is, according to Clark, the problem of deciding between these options here. Is there something really special or mysterious about consciousness that our objective sciences cannot explain and will never be able to explain? Or is consciousness something we have to explain and we just have yet to work out, using the tools we have, how to explain it? Deciding between these two options is what Clark calls the meta-hard problem. In other words, the meta-hard problem is answering the question of whether there is even a hard problem at all. Some people certainly think there is. Chalmers and others like him, who I've already said, think that we cannot use the tools we use to tackle the easy problems to tackle the hard problem. But there are other thinkers like Dennett and Clark who suspect that there may not be a hard problem at all. Really, it's just a matter of time until we are able to explain how subjective experience comes about. And that is the meta-hard problem. And I would like all of you to think about that as you continue your studies, because it's a very interesting thing to think about. This is something that's really on the bleeding edge of cognitive science and philosophy of mind right now. So if any of you are thinking of continuing to study this kind of thing in the future, you may find this interesting, and you may find it a fruitful avenue of research for, I don't know, perhaps an honors thesis or a master's thesis or something like that. In any case, I sympathize with Clark here. I do not think that the hard problem is really as hard as Chalmers thinks it will be. I think it's more of a tricky problem than a really hard problem. So I don't know, maybe I'll start calling it the tricky problem of consciousness. Who knows? But in any case, that is where I sit in this debate. And if you want to know more, again, refer to Appendix number 2. Also check out the opening chapters of Blackmore's book, Consciousness and Introduction, which you can access for free through the Carleton Library online. You can download the entire book and read it on your computer, or just read it in your web browser for free. It's available to you as a Carleton University student. And Blackmore actually breaks down 4 responses to Chalmers's distinction between the easy problem and the hard problem that you can take a look at there, which we do not have time to go into here. But that's the meta-hard problem, and the easy problems and the hard problem. So think about it. Do some thought experiments. If you're not sure where to go, if you're interested on studying more consciousness stuff, let me know if you want to know what the next step you ought to take is. So that's it for my brief, roundabout, meandering chit-chat about consciousness. Let's try and wrap things up. Well, let's wrap things up by taking a look at the final chapter, which is not really very much of a chapter in Clarke's book, Mindware. It's entitled Not Really a Conclusion. And of course, here Clarke doesn't really draw too many firm conclusions. And the reason why is that this is meant to be an introductory text, and what it's meant to introduce you to is not just the science of the mind, but many of the contemporary debates that are going on within the cognitive sciences and within the philosophy of cognitive science as well. So, this is an introductory text, and it deals with a lot of tricky problems. But Clarke thinks that there is one thing that is clear. The mind, he calls it, he says, rather, is a constitutively leaky system. What does that mean? Well, it means that the mind, whatever it is, meat machine, computer, dynamic system coupled with the world, whatever it is, it seems to resist analysis that's pitched at any one level of analysis, and it seems to resist analysis by any single scientific discipline. Psychology, neuroscience, AI. None of these disciplines are up to the task of doing the job by themselves. And we're not able to understand the mind by looking at just one level of analysis or organization within the brain. So this is a multiply disciplinary approach, an interdisciplinary approach. Crucial features of the mind, crucial properties of the mind depend on all kinds of different interactions and reactions across different levels of organization and across different time scales, across the brain, the body, and the world. So the mind, Clarke says, is an intrinsically boundary-crossing phenomenon, and that's what makes it so difficult to study. So this is kind of why Clarke has written this book in the way he has, right? We need our approach to studying the mind to reflect this leaky nature, this boundary-crossing nature of the mind. We need multidisciplinary cooperation, between the different disciplines that comprise the cognitive sciences, and we need interdisciplinary efforts to really understand the mind. Even the idea that we began with, this Mindware as software idea, which seemed like a secure enough place to start, really gets thrown out the window in later chapters. Especially when we start looking at cognitive technology, dynamics, and the extended mind. So, even though this is a good place to start, it's not where the sciences of the mind are going. The sciences of the mind are moving on from this, as Clarke says on page 249. And we need to move along with them. And I think Clarke has done an absolutely bang-up job at writing a book that reflects this. And I've really enjoyed using this resource. I have read this book before. I've never used it to teach. But I think I'm going to keep using it. And I'd like you guys to let me know too. How did you find this book? Was it a challenge? Was it easy to read? Did it make you think about the mind in new and exciting ways that you hadn't thought about the mind before? I'd love to hear from you. So, that's it. We can't really draw any firm conclusions other than that the sciences of the mind continue to push forward, and we'll have to adopt multidisciplinary approaches, interdisciplinary approaches toward really understanding it. Understanding perception, cognition, and ultimately subjective conscious experience. All right, so that is all for our final lecture. Congratulations, everybody. We made it to the end of the semester. And, you'll still have to write your final paper, but I wanted to remind everybody that if you want to meet with me virtually over Discord, do get in touch with me. I am keen to help you out however I can. A couple of other things to keep an eye out for are announcements. I will be making some more announcements kind of over the winter break and into the new year. These will be announcements to let you know when certain things are graded and when your final grades are available and that kind of thing. So, speaking of grading, I have yet to have your midterm short answer questions graded. I do apologize for profusely for how long this has taken. It has been a heck of a time for me, as I imagine it has for you. But I should have this done by Monday. So by Monday, you'll have feedback for your midterms. And then shortly after that, I'll have feedback for your final critical responses. And then sometime toward the end of the winter break, you'll get your grades for your final essay. And if any of you have written a bonus critical response, you'll get your grades for those too. So I want to thank everyone for participating in this class. For everyone who's not in my class, who's stumbled upon these videos and found them interesting, I'm glad you've joined us. I will be back in the new year with more video lectures for my next class, which is a first-year seminar in philosophy on minds and machines. And we're going to be looking at the history of this kind of mind-machine or mind-as-computer analogy, starting all the way back from the ancient Greeks up until the modern day, with thinkers like Alan Turing and Hilary Putnam and all of those cats. So it's going to be really cool. And you are all welcome to watch these videos if you find them interesting and informative. But otherwise, I hope you're all taking care of yourselves. I hope you're doing well. I hope my students are working hard on their essays and that you get in touch with me if you have any questions or if you need a hand with anything. And I hope you all have an enjoyable winter break, if you're celebrating the holidays, if you're celebrating Christmas or Hanukkah or any other holidays, I hope you have a great, relaxing holiday. I hope you get to rest and recharge, spend some time with people that you care about. Be safe. Remember to follow the COVID protocols. Wear your mask, wash your hands, don't get sick, because we'll be back in the new year to study more philosophy and more cognitive science. So, with that, I thank you all for tuning in, and I will see you all next time. Bye for now, everybody.